Welcome to session 5 of our summer school and reading the boy at the back of the class. Okay, so today's objective is we're going to create a description of a character and we're going to look at using descriptive language and phrases. I'd like you to use a simile or a metaphor and use some personification if possible. So we're going to look at chapters 11, 12 and 13 today, the game of Scrabble, Sirrah and the Sea, and there's something that changed everything. So as usual, let's have a look at some vocab first. Okay, so there are 4 words we're going to look at today. Okay, so the first word is a word that you'd be very familiar of. It's survived. So survived is a verb. And it means if someone lives through a difficult experience or serious threats to their life, we say that they have survived. So the reason I picked out this word is because we're looking at it in slightly different context. So for example, I might say I've survived the final week at school, but in this context, it's completely different. It's someone who has survived threats to their lives. You know, they've risked, they've faced death. So an example, some synonyms here are pulled through, remained, persisted or endured. And you've got here the sentence anyway. The important thing is she survived, which straight away I'm thinking, who's she? Who is this, the sister they're talking about or mum? Really interesting sentence there. The word blustery, which is an adjective, which when the wind is blowing in gusts, we say it is blustery. Synonyms for that is stormy, gusty, rough, squally, wild. The example from the text here is that's when all the days are so cold and grey and wet and blustery that you don't want to get out of your pyjamas or bed. So I felt a bit this morning, I didn't really want to get up. International, that's a word that will be very familiar to you, but do you really know what it means? If something is international, it involves more than one country. So synonyms for that are intercontinental, worldwide, multinational. But what if he was a professional snorer on his way to the international snoring championships and was practicing his best snore? So international means more than one country. And the word restrictions. So restrictions are rules that limit what people can do. Synonyms for that are reduction, limitations, constraints and control. So border restrictions as of next month. I knew this would happen. The word racist. A racist is someone who treats people unfairly based on their race or the colour of their skin. So when people sometimes use that word like too casually, but if someone is a racist or considered a racist, it's because they treat someone differently because the colour of their skin or their race or their religion. So that's what a racist is. So synonyms for that are prejudice, bigot, intolerant or xenophobe. Xenophobe's a really big word there, isn't it? So that's all the racists made happy then. So what I'd like you to do is go to your booklet and complete your own sentences using those words. Okay, so let's have a look at chapter 11, 12 and 13, the game of Scrabble, Sirrah and the Sea, the something that changed everything. Chapter 11, the game of Scrabble. After hearing Ahmet's story and seeing his pictures, I was bursting with lots of new questions. So were Tom and Josie and Michael. But we all know we couldn't ask Ahmet anything. We should write them down, suggested Josie. Then maybe after the holidays, Ahmet will have put some more pieces back together, and Mrs. Khan will think it's okay for us to ask him. We all agreed, so when I got home that night, I took out my old list of questions, and after crossing out the ones I had answers to, I wrote the new questions out in my very best handwriting, just to make sure we wouldn't forget any of them. And this is what the list looked like. So we've got his questions here, these are the original ones. The only one he's not answered is, do you have a best friend? So the new questions are, what is your sister's name and where is she now? Why wasn't your mum in the last picture? What happened to the cat? How long did it take to walk to France? Who were the bullies who dropped bombs on your house? After I'd finished writing them out, I put the list into my front pocket of my rucksack. I would have had to wait till the holiday was over to find out if Ahmet was ready to answer any of them. I know everyone in school likes the holidays, but I don't, not really. Mum still has to work and she can't afford to send me to holiday camp or for extra activities, so I have to spend most of my time with Mrs. Abbey. Usually Michael and Josie's parents come and take me to their house for a day, but Michael's parents were taking him on a holiday to France, and Josie was going camping, and Tom and his brothers were visiting family near the seaside, so there was no one to play with this holiday. The week felt extra long and extra boring because London had what Mum calls a grey day week. That's when all the days are so cold and grey and wet and blustery that you don't want to get out of your pyjamas or your bed, and the whole week feels like one long grey day that you can't wait to be over. But on the Sunday morning before school opened again, just as Mum was reading the newspapers and trying to decide what we should do for our Sunday adventure, the phone rang. Mum picked it up, and when she put it back down again, she was biting her lip and frowning. That meant she had forgotten something important and was feeling angry at herself. Darling, I'm so sorry, I completely forgot. That was your Uncle Lenny on the phone reminding me that he's coming to lunch today. I jumped up in excitement. With your Aunt Christina and baby Jacob, she added. I sat back down and made a face. Can't Uncle Lenny just come on his own, I asked. Mum shook her head. No, he can't. Your aunt and Jacob haven't been in a while, so it's nice that they want to come. And then noticing that I was still making a face, she added, and guess what? Uncle Lenny is bringing lunch. Roast chicken, your favourite, and said he wants a Scrabble match, so you're set up the board immediately. I jumped up and ran to my bedroom and to get the Scrabble board from underneath my bed. I love Scrabble more than all the other board games because it's the only game that I don't ever get bored playing. Dad always used to let me win by placing his letters in silly places so that he would get the lowest points, but Mum and Uncle Lenny never play low scoring words on purpose because Mum says that helping me to win is cheating. She just let me use the dictionary though, because otherwise it wouldn't be fair. After all, she and Uncle Lenny are older and cleverer and know lots more words than a 9 3/4-year-old could ever know. And just like that, I didn't mind Aunt Christina and Jacob coming at all, because there's nothing I love better than eating my Uncle Lenny's roast chicken, except playing Scrabble with him. Just like Josie, Uncle Lenny is in all my memories too. When Dad died, I remembered him being at the hospital with us and hugging me and Mum a lot. That was when he started calling me his little brave tiger. I don't know why, because I didn't feel or even the tiniest bit brave. But I didn't mind, because after the funeral, he was the only person who stayed behind and helped Mum sort everything out. None of my other uncles and aunts who visited us that day ever came back to see Mum and me again. Mum's friends try and visit us when they can, and Josie's mum is always asking us if we need help, but they're busy with work just like Mum is. Sometimes I think most of the people who came to the funeral were all really witches and wizards who had appeared out of thin air just so they could eat a buffet and shake their heads a lot before disappearing again. It was good they disappeared because most of them smelled like old mothballs and liked to pinch my cheeks until they hurt. That's another reason I like and love Uncle Lenny. He's never ever pinched my cheeks or smelled like mothballs. He smells like warm bread most of the time and freshly baked cookies some of the time. He's a taxi driver and only works at night. He loves his job and tells the funniest stories about all the different kinds of people who have jumped into the back of his car, like a time a famous actress got in and ordered him to drive around for a whole hour just so she could get some sleep, or the time a large Italian family spent the whole ride silently fighting over a single portion of fish and chips. Whenever my Uncle Lenny visits us, he always brings a large bag of food shopping and a chocolate bar just for me. He doesn't usually come with my Aunt Christina because she doesn't like us. I don't know why, but it's okay because I don't like her either. She's very beautiful and is always perfectly dressed with perfect hair and with perfect makeup on her face, but she wrinkles up her nose whenever she sees something she doesn't like, which is nearly all the time, so she always looks as if she smelled a bag of bad eggs. She has a fake smile too. It's one of those smiles that shows lots of teeth, but which never travels to any other part of her face. I don't trust people who can't smile with their whole face. It means they're trying to hide something from you. Fake smiles always make me want to get as far away from the fake smiler as possible. Their son Jacob is okay, but he's only 2 and likes to break things, so I try to hide all my best toys from him whenever he comes over. After I finished setting up the Scrabble board, I helped Mum tidy up the house and was making my bed sheets extra straight when the doorbell rang. All right. How's my favourite nearly 10-year-old doing? Shouted Uncle Lenny when I opened my door. He always says that, even though I know I'm the only nearly 10-year-old he knows, which means he can't have any other favourites. Okay, I shrugged. Only okay, he asked, bending down and looking me in the eyes. Might need to send you to the smile doctor. I smiled wider. That's better. And he ruffled my hair and gave me a kiss on the cheek. Then he took large grocery bags into the kitchen. Afternoon, said my Aunt Christina. Her lips were pinched together, and she was wearing so much perfume that it made my nose tickle. Jacob's asleep, so you'll have to play with him later, she said matter-of-factly, as she carried Jacob in through the door and stuck out a pointy face at me. I stood on my tiptoes and gave her a kiss. She pulled away quickly. Right, what have you been up to then? Asked Uncle Lenny as he came and steered me into the kitchen table. I think he must be so used to driving his taxi that he liked to drive people around too. Nothing, I shrugged. Do you want to play Scrabble with me now, Uncle Lenny? We'll have a game after lunch, my little tiger, he said. I'm not on until 5 today. Darling, why don't you tell Uncle Lenny all about your new friend? Asked Mum as she set the table. Oh yeah, that pomegranate boy, said Uncle Lenny. Your mum told me. What's happening there then? Lots, I said. I began to tell him all about the big fight and the mysterious plant pot murder and the great baked beans bag trap story and Ahmet's story. And as we ate our lunch, I told them all about the bombs and the fires and the orange boat and the tents and Ahmet's cat on the railway track and the white wall with the barbed wire on it. Uncle Lenny shook his head and muttered, poor Tyke, every few minutes, and Mum nodded along, looking sad sometimes, but Aunt Christina looked bored. Then just as I was about to tell him about my new list of questions, Aunt Christina said, doesn't surprise me you would want to be friends with a refugee kid at all, sweetheart. You'd have lots of things in common with him. What with your gran had been a refugee too. Uncle Lenny and Mum looked up sharply. I can't even bear to think about it. Imagine being a war refugee back in the day, before they all got loads of benefits and houses nicer than our ones. Uncle Lenny looked up angrily and was about to say something when, just then, Jacob began to cry. Aunt Christina jumped off with a sniff. Oh dear, seems he's christened the nappy again, before rushing out of the room. Mum, is that true? I asked, looking at Mum so hard that it felt like my eyes were about to pop out of my head. Was Gran a refugee too? All yours, muttered Uncle Lenny as he got up and walked over to one of the shopping bags. I'll get dessert, shall I? Mum looked at me for a moment and then she said, yes, sweetheart, it is. Your Grandma Jo. We went to see her with Daddy when you were little. Do you remember her? I nodded, not because I really remembered anything, but because I had looked at all the photographs hundreds of times. I was 5, and it was the last time my mum and Dad and me went on holiday in real life. In a real-life plane. We went to a town called Salzburg, which is in a country called Austria, because that's where Dad lived before he moved to England. He used to talk about the mountains and the rivers and the way the birds always seemed to follow him around. He looked so happy in all the photographs, so did Mum. So we've got something interesting going on here now. So we know that his grandmother was a refugee, and we know that grandmother was living in a town called Salzburg in Austria. So straight away your ears and your brain should be picking up some clues as what type of refugee that grandma was. Okay, I seem to be crying in most of my photos, so I'm not sure if I was happy or not. I don't really remember anything about the trip except for the large green wooden caravan my Grandma Jo had in her back garden. Dad used to sleep in it in the summer holidays when he was a boy. My granddad had built it before he died, which is why my dad wanted to become a carpenter. There's a photo of me and Dad sitting on its steps, and it's the only photo of me where I'm not crying. Even then I must have liked the idea of sleeping in a bright green caravan. I couldn't really remember anything about my Grandma Jo, but we had lots and lots of photos of her and Dad, and I always look at them whenever I miss my dad too much. She had short grey hair and wore glasses that were tied into a long golden chain, and she always wore flowery tops and white trousers. I wished I could have remembered her more, but sometimes, no matter how hard you try or how badly you might want to, your brain can't reach that far back. Why was she a refugee, I asked. Did she run away from bombs like Ahmet? Mum stayed quiet as Uncle Lenny placed 4 large chocolate eclairs on the table in front of us. I love chocolate eclairs because it's like having 3 desserts in one, but as much as I wanted to eat my eclair, I wanted to hear the answers to my questions more. Uncle Lenny sat back down and cleared his throat. Don't think they've done World War II in school yet, have they? He asked my mum quietly. Mum shook her head. World War II, I asked. You mean there was another one? Uncle Lenny nodded. Yup, just like the one you learnt about last year, but twice as bad, he whispered, as though it was a secret. Mum put my eclair on a plate and pushed it towards me. All you need to know, darling, is that Grandma Jo is a wonderful person and that she helped lots of refugees just like your friend Ahmet run away from a war too. Were they running away from Syria as well, I asked, wondering how long the war had lasted. No, darling, said Mum, putting her own eclair on a plate. They ran away from a different war, one that started in Germany, and they were running away from people who called themselves Nazis. Oh, I said, wondering just how many wars I needed to learn about. Anyway, the most important thing is she survived and she got to see you, exclaimed Uncle Lenny as he gave my hair a stroke. Exactly, said Mum, tapping my head. Now eat up and let's get a game of Scrabble going before Uncle Lenny has to leave. I nodded, and knowing that my mum didn't want to ask me to ask any more questions, broke open my eclair. That afternoon, Uncle Lenny stayed and played 2 whole games of Scrabble with us, and Aunt Christina wanted watch Jacob break one of Mum's vases, rip a book and throw my Lego bricks across the room. Mum won the first game and Uncle Lenny won the second one, and I got the lowest points I'd ever gotten in history. But I didn't mind. I don't think you can really focus on playing a game when you've just found out that your grandma was a refugee who had helped lots of other refugees run away from a war too, even if you're playing a game that's as fun as Scrabble. So we get the sense here that Mum and Uncle Lenny don't really want to tell the narrator because they don't want to upset him or her, because we still don't know what gender the narrator is, and they don't want to upset him or her because it was such an awful thing of what happened to the Jewish people in Germany. And what we've going on as well, we've got now that parallel between the grandma and Ahmet, so we can kind of see the similarities of how these people are being treated. So chapter 12, Sirah and the Sea. When we all got to school that first Monday of the second term, it turned out that nearly everyone had heard of Ahmet's story. It had spread over the holiday more quickly than news of a new flavoured packet of crisps, and just as quickly as he had become famous for being the boy that beat Brendan the bully, Ahmet became famous for being that refugee boy. I don't think anyone kept their promise to Mrs. Khan of not asking him any questions, because everyone in class tried to sneak at least one whenever they talked to him. Even Josie and Michael and Tom couldn't help themselves and started to ask him things like, did you have cheese sandwiches in Syria? Or what was the weather like in Greece? Or did you ever eat snails and frogs in France? I don't think Ahmet minded because we were his friends. If he understood the question, he would just answer yes or no, and if he didn't understand, he would just stare at us or shrug. But there were lots of people who didn't know asking him lots of questions too. Some of them asked so many questions in one go that even we couldn't understand what they were saying, and we could speak English. Some classes even began to send messengers to see if they could find out anything out. Messengers are usually the smallest kids in a class and are paid in sweets or football stickers or extra lunch tokens to get information. Some of them are okay and leave you alone if you tell them that you don't want to say anything, but the ones that work for the school bullies are especially annoying. It's not their fault really, because they get beaten up if they go back with nothing new to tell, but sometimes they won't listen to you, even after you've already given them an answer. The most annoying messenger in school is Victor. Victor's extra skinny, even though he eats chips every day, and he has a gold earring in his ear. He works for 2 upper school bullies whose names I don't know, but who always hang around the lower boys' toilets and shake anyone that goes in until everything falls out of their pockets. But he also works for a group of girls who always stand around the water fountain, so you never really know who he's messaging for. After everyone found out Ahmet was a refugee, Victor followed us around for nearly a whole week. At break times, at lunch times and even home times, he would suddenly appear and ask lots of questions that even I found strange, like, where did you get your shoes from? And, are you scared of fireworks? Can you make a tent from a shirt? Or, are you really 9 or are you secretly older? That's an interesting question, the secretly older one. Sometimes people say that refugees sneak in and are actually older than they actually are, and they lie about their age, which is an interesting kind of thought that's often untrue. But it's because often these children don't have birth certificates and don't even know when their birthdays are. He got so annoying that even the break duty teachers began to notice and told him to leave Ahmet alone, except Mr. Irons. He was the only teacher who didn't say anything. After he got told off by Mrs. Sanders and Miss Hemsey one break, Victor stayed away, but his questions stayed with us. Sometimes words hang around longer than people, even when you don't want them to. And whenever I was on my own or just with Tom and Josie and Michael, Victor's questions would pop into my head and make me wonder what they meant. The only thing that was even more annoying than the messengers was Brendan the bully, because instead of being nicer to Ahmet after seeing his pictures and hearing his story, Brendan the bully became even more horrible. He seemed to have forgotten that Ahmet could turn into a lion and punch him hundreds of times, because he began to whisper, "Oi, smelly refuge bag," whenever he saw him, and in class he would throw spitballs whenever Mrs. Khan and Miss Hemsey weren't looking. When we told Ahmet to tell Mrs. Khan and Mrs. Sanders about it, he shook his head and said, "I'm not scared. Lots of badder people in camps. My dad say I fight them, so I fight him." When Ahmet said this, I thought he was very brave, so on Halloween I brought him in one of my favourite Tintin books for him to look at, because in it Tintin stays and fights lots of bad guys, even though the bad guys are bigger and there are lots more of them. There are always lots more of them. "See, you're like this, see?" I said, showing him the book. I was dressed as a vampire and Ahmet was dressed as a green monster, although Tom said he was the Hulk. We were sitting in the playground on our own because Tom and Josie and Michael were still eating their lunch and taking too long. Tintin, he cried out when he saw the cover. You know Tintin? I asked, surprised. I hadn't thought about it before, but I guess Tintin really is famous everywhere. Yes, said Ahmet. I read all the time. My dad, he read them to me. I nodded, remembering the voices my dad used to make when he read the comics to me too. After a while I said, I have all of them. You can see them if you like. I keep this, said Ahmet. Oh, I said. I hadn't really meant to give it him the book. I only wanted to show it to him. But I knew I could ask Mum to find me another old copy in the library and save it for me when it was about to be thrown away. So I shrugged and said, sure. Ahmet gave me a big smile and started to flick through it. He stopped at a page and pointed at Captain Haddock. My dad, he had this, he said, moving his finger so that it pointed to Captain Haddock's beard. You? I shook my head. No, my dad didn't have a beard, but also my dad, he's dead. Ahmet nodded sadly and looked down at the picture. I not know where Dad is. Maybe he dead too. I looked over at Ahmet. He's not here in London, I asked. Ahmet shook his head. I come here. My dad, he behind. I frowned. Behind where? Ahmet shrugged and looked down at the comic book. Maybe in France. Oh, I said, feeling sad for him. I'd hate it if I didn't know where my dad was, or if he was still alive. I wanted to ask who the lady in the red scarf was, and whether she could help him find his dad, and where his mum and sister and his cat were, but then Ahmet flicked to another page and held it up to me. He was pointing to a picture in it. In it, Tintin and Captain Haddock and Snowy and the man with an eye patch were all standing on the raft in the middle of the ocean, and Captain Haddock was waving a flag that had been made over his blue jumper. See, said Ahmet quietly. I nodded. I have a sister. Is she there now? You mean there? I asked, pointing to the raft. No, here. He pointed to the ocean, and then I understood. Oh, I said. I felt strange, as if something had just hit me on the inside of my chest. It was the same feeling I had in the hospital when Mum and Uncle Lenny told me that Dad died. You mean your sister? Her name's Sira, said Ahmet. Sira, she is in the sea. Ahmet nodded and rubbed his eyes. Then she's not with your cat? I asked quietly. Ahmet shook his head. Cat dead in mountains. And then flicking to another page, he pointed to a tent. Mum's sick. Last time I see her. Oh, I said. I wanted to cry, but Ahmet wasn't crying, so I didn't think I should either. Instead, I stared at the picture he was pointing to just as hard as I could, so that he couldn't see my eyes. We didn't see anything else after that, because a few seconds later, Michael and Josie came out and joined us. Tom was still inside because it was chocolate pudding day, and he always tried to get an extra piece after everyone left. I waited to see if Ahmet would show him the pictures and tell him about Sira and the sea and his mum too, but he didn't, and when he looked at me and shook his head, I knew that he wanted me to keep it a secret. I nodded back and made a silent promise to Ahmet that I wouldn't tell anyone, but I didn't know that I would be forced to break my promise the very next day, because that's when I heard something, and it was something so scary that it changed everything. So there's a lovely cliffhanger there, isn't there, that makes us want to carry on reading. Number 13, chapter 13. There's something that changed everything. The night after Ahmet had told me about his sister, Sira, being in the sea, and not knowing if his mum and dad were alive, I had trouble getting to sleep. My mum always tells me to count sheep when I can't sleep, but I find sheep too funny. They look like clouds with legs, so I count leopards instead. They're colourful and look serious. I can't remember how many leopards I counted too, but it must have been more than 200 before I eventually drifted off. By the time the morning arrived, I was so tired and my legs moved so slowly that when I got to the bus stop it was late, and Tom and Josie and Michael had already left. I didn't really mind, because getting the bus on my own is fun. I like watching the people passing by on the streets outside, or making guesses about the people sitting next to me. Last week there was a huge man sitting right at the front of the bus, snoring so loudly that he was making all the windows shake. Everyone was watching him and giggling or shaking their heads at him. But what if he had been a world-famous snorer on his way to the International Snoring Championships and was practicing his best snore? You just never know. That morning I was too sleepy to look at anyone and guess stories about them, so I leaned my head on the large window and listened instead. There are always lots of noises on a bus, especially when there are lots of people going to work and trying to get to school, but it's usually noises like the doors opening and closing and people ringing the bell and tickets beeping on the ticket machine. Nobody really talks to anyone else unless they're with friends or asking for a seat. Uncle Lenny says it's because we're English, and English people would rather die than have to speak to someone they don't know. I think I can't be very English if that's true. I don't think I'm very English either then. The bus had passed 2 stops, and except for a baby who was making loud gurgling noises, it was nice and quiet. I think everyone must have been as sleepy as me. But then at the third stop, a woman dressed in a bright yellow coat and a man dressed in a suit came and sat in front of me, picking up the free newspaper lying on both their seats, began talking loudly about the things they were reading. At first they talked about the economy being broken by rich people who weren't paying their taxes and hiding all their money away in a place called offshore. Then they talked about a princess who was going out with an actor they didn't like and a famous singer who had been arrested for hitting someone. I was starting to fall asleep when the man suddenly said something which made me sit up in my seat and listen just as hard as I could. "Oh, ain't it horrible," the man said. "Look at what they're saying about refugees, border restrictions as of next month. I knew this would happen." The woman shook her head, looking over his shoulder at the paper. "Those poor people, where are they meant to go? Back to that nightmare they left behind, as left to starve in France." "Cheaper for us to leave them in France," said the man, shaking his head. "Says here the borders will be closed by the end of the month, so that's all the racists made happy then." The woman tutted, "Rescuing kids out of the sea 1 minute and then telling them they can't be helped the next. Some of them might have family here. Poor things, that should count for something." The man read the newspaper for a few more seconds and then said, "Well, apparently not. Says here that we've taken in a few hundred, so we're not going to take in any more. Doesn't matter how little they are." It was my stop. As soon as I got off the bus, I ran as fast as I could to school. My heart was beating so loudly that I could hear it in my ears, but I didn't care. If what the man was saying was right, then after next month, Ahmet's mum and dad would never be allowed in England, and Ahmet would never see them again. I needed to tell Tom and Michael and Josie about what I had heard, and I had to tell them everything about without Ahmet hearing. But when I reached the school gates, the bell for registration was already ringing and the playground was nearly empty. I ran to the classroom just before Mrs. Khan started to take the register. She looked at me with a frown but didn't say anything. "Where were you?" whispered Josie. "We waited until the second bus came." I was too out of breath to say lots of words, so I just said, "Slept late." That morning, Mrs. Khan put us in 2 big groups so that we could write a play on the story of Romulus and Remus and act it out. It's a legend about 2 baby boys whose mum hid them in a basket and sent them far away so they wouldn't be killed by people who were jealous of them. I guess they were refugee boys like Ahmet was. Said Ahmet's mum didn't put him in a basket, he came in a boat. Mrs. Khan and Miss Hemsey said Ahmet could join the class on this project, so Ahmet and Tom were put in my group and Tom and Josie were put in the other group. I was trying to think about how to let them know of what I heard when Mrs. Khan told everyone to get a piece of coloured paper and a special handwriting pen from her desk so we could write out our own lines. I decided to take an extra piece of paper, and while everyone was busy looking through their workbooks to find out which character they wanted to play, I quickly wrote a top secret message. It said this: "I heard something on the bus. We mustn't tell Ahmet about it. Meet me in the library at break time. Top secret." I folded the message up until it was so small that I could hide it in my hand, and when Mrs. Khan and Miss Hemsey weren't looking, I passed it to Tom. Tom looked around, and when nobody except me was watching him, he opened it up and read it. Then he gave me a nod, and pretending to need another piece of paper, went up to Mrs. Khan's desk and gave Josie the note on the way back to his seat. Then I saw Josie read the note quickly and pass it to Michael, who dropped it on the floor, but luckily everyone was too busy writing their lines to notice, and he snatched it back up again. He looked over at me and gave me the thumbs up, and then stuffed the top secret message into his pocket. As soon as the bell for first break began to ring and Mrs. Khan told us to leave everything where it was, I ran to the library room and waited outside. It was the one place in school no one ever tried going in at break time. A few minutes later, Josie and Michael came running up the corridor. "Tom's in the playground with Ahmet," said Josie. "We can fill him in later." "What did you hear?" asked Michael, his eyes wide. I quickly told him everything the man and the woman on the bus had said about no more refugees being allowed into the country, and then what Ahmet had told me about his mum and dad being left behind. I had to tell them about his sister Sira too. I felt bad about breaking my promise, but I knew that Ahmet wouldn't mind me telling Josie and Michael about it, because this was a real emergency and they were his friends too. "You mean, if he doesn't find them before the end of the month, then Ahmet might never see his mum and dad again?" I shook my head. "Not once the government closes the border gates." "Yes," said Michael. "They're like giant airport ones with lots of police and guards protecting them, and you can't go through them when they're closed, so you get put into jail." Michael looked at his watch and pressed a button so that it lit up and showed the date. "If they're closing all the gates at the end of this month, that means he's only got 9 days to find them." "What do we do?" asked Josie. "I say we tell Mrs. Khan and Miss Hemsey. They'll know what to do." Michael and Josie agreed. We ran to the staff room and knocked loudly on the door. We're not supposed to disturb teachers in the staff room at break time because that's where they go to drink lots of tea and find the answers to questions that they can't find in their answer books. I know because Josie's aunt is a teacher and she told Josie had told me, but Mrs. Khan and Miss Hemsey had told us to go and find them if something was wrong, and this something felt like the most something I'd ever heard of. After a few seconds, Mr. Gaffer opened the door and looked down at us with a frown. He's the deputy head, which means he's in charge on the days Mrs. Sanders is away, but Mrs. Sanders is never ever away, so I don't really know what he does. "Yes?" he asked. "Please, sir, we need to see Mrs. Khan and Miss Hemsley immediately," I said. "It's an emergency," added Josie. "Is it really?" he said suspiciously. We all nodded our heads at least 10 times. "All right, just hold on," replied Mr. Gaffer as he closed the door. Josie twisted her hair nervously around her finger and stuffed a whole chunk in her mouth, and Michael started kicking the wall lightly as we waited. After what felt like 20 whole minutes, but couldn't really have been more than one, Mrs. Khan and Mrs. Hemsley came to the door. "Is something the matter?" asked Mrs. Khan. "Is it to do with Ahmet?" We all nodded again. Miss Hemsley and Mrs. Khan stepped out into the corridor and closed the staff room door behind them. We all started talking at once. Mrs. Khan held up her hands and said, calm down now. One at a time, please." "Miss, the governments are going to close the gates," I began. Josie said, "And Ahmet's mum and dad are on the other side. They might get stuck. And there's only 9 days left until the gates close," said Michael, showing Mrs. Khan his watch. Mrs. Khan and Mrs. Hemsley looked at each other and looked back at us. "What do you mean by gates?" asked Mrs. Khan. "You know, the gates at the edge of the borders, the ones where all the police and the big guns are. The refugees have come through them to get into the country." "Ah," said Mrs. Khan. "And where did you hear they were going to be closed? Was it on the news?" "I told her about the man and the woman on the bus." "I see," said Mrs. Khan. She was quiet for a moment, and I saw her give Miss Hemsley another look. Then she said, "Ahmet is a lucky boy to have such caring friends, but you don't have to worry about it at all. His foster mother, who you've seen coming to pick him up every single day after school, is there to look after him until his family can be found, and she's working with some very clever people to try and help Ahmet find his family just as quickly as possible." We all looked over each other in surprise. So the woman in the red scarf was Ahmet's foster mum. Everything was beginning to make sense, and all our questions were being answered too. "Clever people like who, miss?" asked Michael. "Well, clever people from the government," said Mrs. Khan, "and lawyers and some wonderful kind-hearted ministers who are working in Parliament, and charities too," said Miss Hemsley. "That's right," agreed Mrs. Khan. "They're doing everything they can to make sure Ahmet's mum and dad are found. That's their job. But what if they don't find his family before they close the gates?" I asked. Miss Hemsley and Mrs. Khan smiled, but they didn't smile with their whole faces, so I knew right away that they were just pretend smiles. "Everyone is doing everything they can," said Mrs. Khan again. Miss Hemsley nodded, and then looking at me asked, "Ahmet spoke to you about his family and what happened to his sister?" I nodded, but suddenly feel nervous. I had promised Ahmet that I would keep it a secret, and I hadn't. Miss Hemsley smiled and said my name softly. "That's a very good thing," she said. "A very, very good thing." The bell rang, and Mrs. Khan made us promise not to upset Ahmet by talking about the border gates or telling anyone about his sister. We all promised, and Mrs. Khan said, "Everything will be fine, you'll see." I nodded, but I didn't think she sounded very sure. In fact, I didn't think everything was going to be fine at all. Not if Ahmet didn't find his family before the gates closed. That afternoon we told Tom what had happened, and we all came to a decision. We were going to try and help instead, and to do that we would need to go on our first ever top secret mission. Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to think about these discussion questions, and I want you to have a go at making some notes in the box. So why do you think they would possibly want to close the borders to people who are fleeing from a war? So what reasons might they want to do that? What are racists, and why do we think the racist people would be happy if the borders were closed? Why do we think it's a good thing if Ahmet is talking about his family and the journey? And what interesting piece of information did we find out in this passage? And the passage is on the book there for you to have a look at. So make some notes in your discussion box there for me. Pause the video now. Okay, today's independent activity is in your booklet. It's not a massively long one. What I want you to do is I want you to write a description of a refugee. I would like you to think about what a refugee might look like when arriving in London after making the very difficult journey from Syria. I want you to think about what their hair might look like. Could you use personification? What do their eyes look like? Could you use a simile? What do their clothes look like? Think about what might have happened to them on the journey, and describe how they are feeling, and think about some powerful language. That's your final activity today, to write a description of what you think a Syrian refugee might actually look like. So think about Ahmet when you do this task. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll see you for tomorrow's session.